but at what cost? In a seemingly dramatic twist that has rattled Western allies and emboldened Russia, U.S. President Donald Trump serves as a broker to immediate ceasefire talks between Russia and Ukraine, but without tightening sanctions on Russia or demanding concessions. As Putin stalls on timelines and Europe escalates pressure, Trump's hands-off approach raises a deeper question. Can diplomacy thrive without accountability, or is this just diplomacy on Russia's terms? Well, these and many more will be detailed in today's Flash News. Good afternoon and welcome. I am Tabitha Ako. Let's begin. United States President Donald Trump says Russia and Ukraine have agreed to immediately begin ceasefire negotiations following his call with Russian President Vladimir Putin on Monday. But with the Kremlin offering no timeline and European leaders reacting with caution and sanctions, the path to a ceasefire deal still hangs by a thread. In a social media post, President Trump declared that negotiations to end the war will start immediately, and he said he had informed Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and top European leaders, including those of France, Germany, Finland, and Italy during a group call. However, Putin who was more measured after the call, he acknowledged a willingness to explore a peace memorandum, but gave no firm commitment on timing. Although efforts are on the right track, it poses the question if Biden is subtly buying time to continue military operations while appearing to be cooperative, and is President Trump playing into it? Let's take a look.
Just spent 2.5 hours talking to Vladimir Putin, and I think some progress has been made. It's a terrible situation going on over there. We also spoke to the heads of most of the European nations, and we're trying to get that whole thing wrapped up. I think it would be great to have it at the Vatican. Maybe it would have some extra significance. And I saw that it was discussed yesterday, so I thought, and people told me that they'd be honored to do it. I would imagine they would be. So, no, I think it would be maybe helpful. There's tremendous bitterness, anger, and I think maybe that could help some of that anger. So having it at the Vatican would be, in Rome, would be I think it'd be a great idea.
President Trump right there, but while talking about sanction, President Trump might perceive that there could be a right and a wrong time for sanctions, but would the chances be worse if sanctions are offered? Meanwhile, the thought of Putin's crafty actions also reflects in former Swedish Prime Minister Carl Bildt's statement, as he calls the moment undoubtedly a win for Putin, warning that the Russian leader may now prolong the war under the guise of diplomacy. Now, if President Trump refrains from sanctions, is he neutralizing United States leverage, or is he betting on diplomacy over pressure, and at what cost? Meanwhile, over to President Zelensky, he is open to direct talks in any format that brings results, suggesting Turkey, Switzerland, or the Vatican as a potential host for recurrent peace talks. Well, Trump added that Pope Leo XIV had shown interest in hosting discussions, though the Vatican has yet to confirm. Still on with the ceasefire talks, Putin still insists on Ukrainian withdrawal from regions Russia claims is complicating any path forward. Now, he emphasized that a future memorandum should include principles of settlement and timing of a possible peace agreement. However, can meaningful peace talks proceed while Russia demands concessions that challenge Ukrainians' sovereignty? While Ukraine has repeatedly refuted any chances to accept these concessions, they also confirmed no timeline was discussed for the ceasefire, though there were talks of a prisoner exchange, which is 9 Russians for 9 Americans, but then Russian officials emphasized the process will take time with complex contacts ahead. Now, in other bid, European leaders reportedly expressed shock over Trump's reluctance to push harder against Russia. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen diplomatically noted that it was important that the United States stays engaged in the talks. Now, this development places Trump, known for his previous cordial stance toward Putin, at the center of a global issue, raising the question if this is Trump's positioning and Trump positioning himself as a peace broker, as he has constantly reiterated, or is he helping to reshape the balance of power in favor of authoritarian negotiation tactics? It's a critical question right there. But then, as Putin's forces control about 20% of Ukraine's territory and continue advancing any claims of peace, this must be critically evaluated against actions on the ground. Well, as we keep getting subsequent updates on this issue, we'll be moving over to the Middle East. Prime Minister Netanyahu vows full control of Gaza amid rising global outrage and humanitarian crisis. As airstrikes intensify and hunger spreads across Gaza, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu declared on Monday that Israel will maintain full control over the territory even as international pressure forces a partial opening for aid deliveries in Gaza. Now, with famine looming and even United States support showing cracks, the big question looms: is Israel's path to victory, pushing the conflict beyond its moral and strategic limits? Netanyahu's vow came as the Israeli Defense Forces warned residents in Khan Younis to flee immediately, preparing what they called an unprecedented attack. At the same time, aid trucks began entering northern Gaza for the first time in weeks, a move prompted by growing alarm from European leaders and a rare warning from long-term United States allies. Now, Netanyahu has made a statement addressing both international critics and hardline members of his coalition who oppose allowing aid. He acknowledged that even staunch pro-Israel U.S. senators are beginning to question the war effort, citing disturbing images of starvation and civilian casualties. He warned Israel was approaching a red line where it could lose control. But how is that visible? European powers, also including France, Germany, and the UK, have openly called the situation intolerable. Meanwhile, humanitarian officials say Gaza needs at least 500 aid trucks per day. On Monday, just 5 to 9 trucks were allowed in. Now, this poses a question. If support from Israel's closest allies is slipping, what is the cost of maintaining this strategy and who benefits from prolonging the suffering? A controversial US-backed plan to deploy private contractors to distribute aid is also drawing fire. The United Nations and World Food Programme have rejected the model, calling it unworkable and insufficient. Over 116,000 metric tons of food, enough to feed 1 million people for months, remain stalled, while donors have pledged over $100 million to a new Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. Now, the details of which remain murky. In the past 8 days alone, more than 500 Palestinians have been killed by Israeli strikes, with 40 killed on Monday, including children and displaced families in schools and shelters. Meanwhile, ceasefire negotiations in Qatar appear stalled. Hamas blames Israel for the lack of progress, while Netanyahu insists on Hamas exile and Gaza's demilitarization terms already rejected by the group. Now, former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, a Netanyahu critic, slammed the government for lacking a post-war plan and said Hamas' continued presence in Gaza marked a resounding failure. Now, if Hamas remains operational, like we see, and no political solution is on the horizon, what does victory actually mean, and for whom? And is the new aid plan a lifeline or a distraction from addressing the structural root of Gaza's humanitarian collapse and Israel's continuous cry for peace and for the release of its hostages? Now, the war began after Hamas-led militants attacked Israel communities on October 7, 2023, killing around 1,200 people and taking 251 hostages, according to Israeli reports. Since then, Israel's response has killed over 53,000 people, many of them civilians, according to Gaza's health authorities. Now, nearly all of Gaza's residents have been displaced, raising alarms of collective punishment and long-term instability. Now, this situation raises critical questions as diplomatic talks are underway and as the humanitarian crisis spirals and Israel's goals remain unmet. The current strategy would have to be sustainable. Well, moving on African scene, the United Nations Court rules in favor of Equatorial Guinea in oil-rich island dispute with Gabon. In a ruling that could reshape energy politics and regional diplomacy in Central Africa, the International Court of Justice has sided with Equatorial Guinea in its long-standing dispute with Gabon over the sovereignty of 3 tiny but oil-rich islands. The judgments delivered at the United Nations top court in The Hague hands control of the contested territories, including Mbani Islands, the largest and most resource-rich to Equatorial Guinea. But it raises deeper questions about the role of colonial-era treaties, the future of resource competition, and the fragile unity between two uneasy neighbors. Can international law resolve disputes rooted in colonial legacies without igniting new tensions or power imbalances? Meanwhile, at the heart of the case were 3 mostly uninhabited islands in the Gulf of Guinea, valuable not for population or land mass, but for the oil reserves in their coastal waters. Now, Equatorial Guinea and Gabon both rely heavily on petroleum exports, but as reserves in existing fields decline, these islands have taken on outsized strategic importance. Well, the dispute first turned into hot in 1972 when Gabon seized Mbani Islands from Equatorial Guinea following a military standoff. After decades of stalled diplomacy and rising economic stakes, the 2 countries jointly turned to the International Court of Justice in 2021, seeking a binding decision. Now, while this could be a step, it could mean that African states still lacks the regional mechanism to resolve disputes without global arbitration. But then how is that possible? Meanwhile, the court decision hinged on a 19,000 treaty signed between colonial powers Spain and France, which the International Court of Justice ruled as the authoritative legal document governing the island's ownership. In contrast, a 1974 agreement, which is the Bata Convention, which had awarded the islands to Gabon, was rejected by the judges. Not a treaty having the force of law, said Judge Juliana Sebutende, emphasizing that Gabon failed to produce an original copy or sufficient legal backing for its claims. Now, this effectively means the colonial-era boundaries drawn over a century ago still hold legal weight today, a precedent that could reverberate in other African territorial disputes. And it also poses a question: should 21st century sovereignty be determined by deals struck by 19th century colonizers? Who truly benefits when those maps are enforced today? What happens next? While the ruling is legally binding, the real test lies in how Gabon responds. Will it accept the loss, or will the judgment fall nationalist backlash at home? For Equatorial Guinea, the ruling represents both a diplomatic win and a potential economic bust, but it must also now manage tensions with a neighbor who once controlled the territory. Also, observers have taken note that neither side wanted open conflict, and their decision to seek International Court of Justice arbitration is seen as a sign of growing legal maturity in African diplomacy. Still, the ruling adds to a delicate balance in a region where borders, oil, and history often collide. Well, bringing you over to the conclusion of this report. In the long run, this ruling might become a blueprint for peaceful resolution across Africa and further reigniting an unresolved post-colonial grievances. Well, until next time, this is where we'll be drawing the curtain on today's Flash News. Remember, we'll be bringing you untold stories from the home front and Undaunted at the top of the hour, 8 p.m. Until then, do have a pleasant day and stay safe.